So the history talks about that our culture, our law has been raped. It's a sad story. But that story needs to be told so that the world can understand, the world can know that what is happening in the other corner of the world, which has been a hidden gender, has to be publicly known and proclaimed.
The earth will not vanish. That's the law and the fundamental belief. It's this soil here, the land. That's our law. It has been existing before the colonization of westernized world.
For 60,000 years, Australia has been home to over 400 Aboriginal nations. Over 2 centuries of conflict, oppression and assimilation have left them fighting for their cultural survival. Nearly half of their languages have been lost, and many are critically endangered. Across the country, the clash between worlds continues.
The dramatic scenes of the first landing at Circular Quay are reenacted at Palm Cove. In the shadow of a modern city, a replica of His Majesty's ship Supply rides at anchor, where the real Supply was hove to on January the 26th, 1788. We see the natives gathering in corroboree to ward off the invaders, just as they then did. Keep the anchoring signal flying, bosun.
This is how white Australians celebrated 150 years of settlement, which black Australians would describe as invasion.
Before Captain Phillip lands, Lieutenant Ball takes a boatload of Marines ashore to keep the natives in check. In the face of menacing savages, the white men advance up the shore of the new land.
Especially as there appear to be no women amongst them. Is there any likelihood of an ambush? See that no Indians remain skulking about.
Now Phillip himself lands. So a handful of Englishmen took possession of a continent, a vast, unknown, primeval land.
It is now fitting that we should turn our minds to the purpose underlying this enterprise, which is to plant a fresh sprig of empire in this new and vast land. It may be that this country will become the most valuable acquisition Britain has ever made.
The flag of England is hoisted again where it first flew in Australia, this time watched by thousands of Australian-born citizens of the Empire.
The Aborigines taking part in this reenactment were press-ganged into playing roles. They were brought to Sydney and held overnight in a police compound next to dog kennels, and they were warned that if they didn't cooperate, their food rations would be stopped. In 1988, it will be the 200th anniversary of the British in Australia. Who will play the menacing savages has yet to be decided. At the white man's school, what are the children taught? Are they told of the battles our people fought? Are they told how our people died? Are they told why our people cried? Australia's true history is never read, but the black man keeps it in his head. And yet there are few countries in which an historical conspiracy of silence has been so complete as here in Australia. This was a frontier country, and it still is. On one side of the frontier in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there were the English poor and Irish political prisoners sent by Britain as slaves. On the other side of the frontier, in deepest shadow, lived a mysterious and remarkable nation whose people could trace their roots back 40,000 years. Britain waged war against this nation. Massacres as systematic as those practiced against the Jews in the 20th century were carried out in the name of God, king, anthropology, money and land. The jolly swagman was not especially jolly. The billabongs ran with blood. Few or none of these events were recorded and remembered by white Australians. And as the cities grew, the descendants of the white slaves, Australians like myself, seldom glimpsed the other side of the frontier, the outback as we called it. As children, we were given to understand that we were merely innocent bystanders to the slow and natural death of an ancient people, the first Australians, rather than the inheritors of a past every bit as rapacious as that of the United States, Latin America, Africa. All that was unmentionable and secret. This picture was taken at an Aboriginal reserve in the Northern Territory in 1968. Called the Palms, it was my first glimpse of what I'd never imagined, an Australian gulag beyond the frontier. How did they get away with it? In Aboriginal cemeteries, the number of children's graves is always disproportionately high. In 1983, two researchers using Queensland government statistics found that Aboriginal deaths from preventable infectious diseases in that state were as much as 300 times higher than the white average and among the highest in the world. In New South Wales, a report found that almost a quarter of Aboriginal males who had survived to the age of 20 were dead by 40. These are third world statistics. A third world disease, trachoma, is widespread in black Australia. Trachoma grows ulcers on the eyes and causes blindness. Leprosy is also virulent. In recent years, the rate of new lepers has dropped by only 20% in Australia, compared with an 80% drop in Upper Volta, the poorest country in the world. Black Australians may well have the highest prison population in the world. Convictions related to homelessness, alcoholism, and unemployment have meant, in effect, that to be black is a crime. In education, black children who not long ago were taught that their society was pagan are now taught to question it, while all the time being rejected by the alternative white society. Too many black Australians live in tin shelters like these, which boil in summer and freeze in winter, which have an ablution block if they're lucky, and taps that seldom run. Australians give generously to Cambodia and Ethiopia, but this is not a cause. For beyond the suburbs it remains out of sight and out of mind. How the first Australians have survived and actually increased their number in recent years is phenomenal.
All those can never kill the Aboriginal spirit. It can. Man has done terrible things to the Aboriginal man, the physical part of us. It has caused everything you've said it has. The degradation has been there, but that's just a reflection on the European white ways, not the Aboriginal spirit. The Aboriginal spirit is a shining, pure spirit which still is part of this.
I think it is our greatest victory that we have hung on to our humanity. I think it is not true that we have been dehumanised in the way that so many other peoples of the world have been dehumanised by decolonisation. And in fact, it frustrates many of our white sympathisers that Aboriginal people are still so kind and prepared to accept white people.
As the oldest culture in the world is besieged by its youngest. One such place is northeast Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, the home of the Yolngu people. Gulawinku on Elcho Island is the largest community in the region.
Their culture is alive and well to this day. We are not here to fade away. We are not here to die out slowly, but we are here to retain our heritage, our beliefs, our spirituality. And that's the way our old people have kept it, and that's the way they are handing it down to us, and that's the way we will hold to hand down to our generation.
Uni ora namuna ta yudia ngonga tangala ramulka ora kapilmayo kadal karayo mulka ora dia namuna ta yo kakapandu kakamanongo yo
Palanda law like all and change because government is always change. Marako Rome, buying on knowing to change. This is law from coming in from Ghana. That's why buying will change.
During the late 1800s and early 20th century, whilst much of the country was being colonised, the Yolngu gained a reputation as proud warriors who fiercely resisted any occupation by outsiders. Today, whilst their culture remains strong, their future, like that of other Aboriginal nations across Australia, is under threat.
My name's Genevieve. I'm a single mother with 4 children and 9 granddaughter and grandson. I live here at Warwanga. And I'm being a strong grandmother, but living in a place awkward with 3 families for themselves, only a 3-bedroom house.
Hidden from the eyes of the world, 2/3 of Aboriginal people in remote communities like Gulawinku live in overcrowded housing.
This room here is where all the elder boys, all the old boys, you know, the family stop here, our sons and nephews. They have this one special room there. There's 5 of them. Go with you. Let's say 5 to 6 boys again live in this room. All my other nephews and sons. This is like the overcrowding of a house. Just this one house. Go with you. Go with you. This is half of the family in this house. Tonight it will be like a full house.
When they were living together, 20 or 30 people in one house, it's ridiculous. For health, it's like living in 700 years in Europe.
We have to be overcrowded because there's no more housing, and there's promises like housing is going to be built, yet we're still waiting for that houses.
Medical research has consistently shown the link between overcrowded housing and infectious ear, eye and skin diseases, all of which are now widespread in Gulawinku.
Diseases and illnesses that are commonplace in the third world but ought to be unheard of in a rich industrialized country like Australia. The levels of those in many Aboriginal communities are appalling.
Health and mortality statistics in remote Aboriginal communities are some of the worst in the world. On average, an Indigenous person will die 17 years younger than a non-Indigenous Australian. Child mortality is 3 times higher.
It's a huge indictment, I think, of Australian government policy over recent decades that things have been allowed to get this bad.
Despite decades of government attempts to close the health gap faced by Indigenous Australians, little has improved, with Aboriginal life expectancy now the lowest of any Indigenous group in the world.
It's a poverty. We live in a poverty. But that wasn't our problem. We were rich. We were rich when we were living alone in our country.
Before the arrival of missionaries in 1942, the Yolngu lived a nomadic life on their ancestral clan estates, now known as homelands.
In olden days, people used to get buying of sickness at all, nothing sickness, nothing, healthy all the time. Because ngata in Aboriginal food is balanced. Yolngu people doesn't live in one place all the time. They move from place to place. Mainly missionary people make us stay in one place and give us raising, house and all those.
In the mission like Kaliwingu and many other places, we're being taken away from our estate, our country, where there is a value, where there is a taka, where a really good taka, a good food, a natural food. We were taken away by church, by the welfare. We've been taken away. We were put into the yard, and they said to us, stay in the yard.
The imposition of this new way of life has been shown to cause ongoing problems for Indigenous people in Australia.
People who are predominantly based in townships, they don't get enough exercise. Their nutrition is much poorer, and subsequently they have greater rates of obesity and high blood pressure and greater rates of diabetes and heart disease.
Indigenous Australians are now up to 40 times more likely to die from diabetes than non-Indigenous Australians, a disease that had never existed before the arrival of Europeans.
It wasn't our dream to come to the yard. It wasn't our dream to come and eat in a white man's table. It wasn't our dream to come and wear white man's clothes. It wasn't our dream to work for the white man as a slave. We were free people.
Throughout these changes, which in places like Gulawinku have only taken place over the last 70 years, Indigenous people have been expected to fast adapt to Western society.
Yolngu here, they don't understand. They don't understand how to live. Living in a Balanda's world, that person should have an education first. Somebody to come and help that person or show. But they just come and growling at people.
On top of these rapid changes to their lives, their traditional systems of law and governance have been undermined by white authority.
Balanda is pushing Yolngu. Balanda is trying to say, look at my way. This is a better way.
Aboriginal traditional law is still alive today and still practiced. Ceremony are still alive. What's been happening in the last 100 years or more is that we are ascending into two laws. Our own law and the Western law or the Balanda law. The law that was introduced to us, a law that is now being practiced in this country.
For generations, the lives of Aboriginal people have been controlled by government departments based thousands of kilometres away, who have devised laws and policies without the involvement of Aboriginal people.
The government has done many damage by trying to establish an organisation which will control Aboriginal people, like Aboriginal Affairs, Welfare for Native Affairs, then Indigenous Affairs, just to look after us like we were a little child. Our law has been ignored, rejected.
He's got brain tree scarring, hasn't he?
Yeah.
You know, my baby...
30 years of research have shown that in order to improve Aboriginal health, communities must be given back control of their own lives.
Aborigines are not consulted about policy and planning. In many places, Aborigines want to be involved and really care enough, but they can't get involvement at other than on a most menial level. And this is appalling. This is particularly so in West Australia and in the Northern Territory. And they should be, in fact, making decisions and being consulted effectively.
Aboriginal involvement must be improved. Only then can their health and their pride and dignity as a people be restored.
To this day, however, this specialist research has been ignored. Ongoing disempowerment and decades of inappropriate government policies have caused the health of the Yolngu, like other Aboriginal nations across Australia, to spiral. In 2007, Gulawinku had a glimpse of hope that things would finally change in their community.
Minister for Indigenous Affairs in the previous government, Minister Honourable Malbrap, when he came here, he introduced himself, we were really happy, we got this man.
What's the material that you're using here? I don't mean the art.
He came, he promises that he's going to give a 50 house. He's going to give a good health, there'll be education and classroom, new buildings, new houses, everything. That was his promises. You know, we said to him, look, this is good, this is the way things need to happen. And so there was a lot of that discussion. But when we start to serious about things, when we start to put our head together and start to talk about serious things, that's where the bombs start. And we said, now I'm minister. It doesn't happen this way. We cannot sell a value of land or lease it for a long time. This is the only hope for us. Billions and billions and billions of square in the continent of Australia, you already bought it. You're not satisfied. Why? What do you want more land for? Go back. Don't tempt us to sign. So he went back.
The federal government is about to intervene in Aboriginal communities in a way thought unimaginable just a few years ago.
We have decided to act. The decisions we have taken are non-negotiable.
The Prime Minister has rejected criticism of his radical plan to curb Indigenous child sexual abuse.
The government's actions came in response to yet another report on the underlying conditions in Aboriginal communities. this time on the symptom of child abuse.
Where there is unemployment, poverty, alcoholism, drug taking, overcrowding, you can guarantee that those children at some point are severely at risk and eventually are going to be sexually abused or abused in some way.
The first recommendation of the Little Children Are Sacred report once again urged the government to commit to genuine consultation with Aboriginal people.
I do not believe in any way, shape nor form that the recommendations flowing from that report reflected the urgency.
In an unprecedented crackdown, the Prime Minister moved to take control.
Every single one of them has pedophiles operating in them. Now that is a national emergency.
The government will seize control of Aboriginal townships and access to lands will be opened up.
We need to have control over the homes, the conditions that they are in, who is in them and what is occurring in those homes.
I don't think you can respect power structures in these communities when clearly those structures have failed to deliver.
Among his sweeping changes, dozens of extra interstate police will be sent in and 50% of welfare will be quarantined.
It is interventionist, I accept that, but what matters more? The constitutional niceties or the care and protection of young children?
Whilst declaring the Little Children Are Sacred report as cause for emergency action, the government ignored nearly all of its 97 recommendations.
I was shocked. That was not the response that one would expect to such a sensitive issue. The government didn't speak to community leaders or talk to the Aboriginal community or get any advice. They just went and did what they did.
That's what this is about. This is what we're trying to do.
We need proper consultation, like from your government.
Yeah.
Come in here and give us.
Well, we've already done it.
Yeah.
We've already done it.
You've already done
this
it.
is already law.
All right.
And the reason for that is that it was an emergency.
We basically a bit upset too, like as being a landowner.
Yeah.
We haven't been consulted.
Yeah.
About,
Yeah.
You know.
No. Well, no, that's right. I acknowledge that those people, like Reg, have got every right to be a bit cross with me because there was no consultation. Yeah. And the only thing I can say, there was no consultation with anyone else either.
Without any consultation with Aboriginal landowners, the government seized all community assets and dismantled community-run programs. It brought in white officials to manage the communities, replacing institutions that communities had taken years to build up. Communities across the Northern Territory were devastated.
We have been demonised for mistreating our children, pedophilia, alcohol abuse. What we need to do is to listen to the people when these situations are found to be in any community without passing judgment.
The intervention has further stigmatised Aboriginal people by erecting signs in each of the seized communities, publicly displaying its new laws.
It's really sad. It makes me feel, that means they're including all Yolngo, all Bookmark Yolngo. Everybody, every Yolngo doing bad things.
This is what they call a lucky country, but not so lucky up here. We're going through so much pain, many of our old people are going through so much thinking, so much worry.
I got now feeling, it's a pain. It's a real painful, it's a real hurt. Not only me, I am too old, but it's gonna be that the feelings will be continue dragging to the next generation to come.
It was only aligned to Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, so, totally racist. And you know what? They're all black. Oh, isn't that a surprise? Not for us, it isn't. You have always been a racist government. from the very day you arrived here.
This is an outrageous authoritarian crackdown.
Now we're seeing elements of racism.
The government is treating the people of the Northern Territory, the people of Australia, with contempt.
And what are we then here? Are we the citizen of Australia? Young people without our rights? See, how can they be saying you are a citizen of Australia if we don't have the rights of anything?
What are my people? What are they? Are they human beings? Have they got a pride and dignity just the same as a man or a woman or a child living in the city?
And then they're using the children boozing so that everyone will be quiet around the world today. No, that's liar. They was putting the front of that one so that everyone world today is listening, because his children is special.
What cost do you put on the life of a child?
There's widespread sexual abuse of children. What greater responsibility do you have than the care of children?
Children deserve and need us to implement things today.
Don't take that, but you don't listening for that. That's only covering area. That's only the blanket. The world wanted to have a look what they was looking for really, government in Australia, to take up the dignity right and the land.
And I had a dream, and they might have had the dream for a long time, to start this intervention.
We believe that this government is using child sexual abuse as the Trojan horse to resume total control of our lands.
The government undermined key parts of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, designed to give Aboriginal people control and ownership over their lands.
They ignored setting up rehab programs for children who's been abused. You know, they didn't even mention that. All they talked about was sending in the troops, sending in more public service.
You know, the widespread abuse, you know, the pedophilic activity, the sale of, you know, sex for petrol, you know, all abhorrent activities. What's interesting is that 3 police inquiries are yet to identify a pedophile ring. They've yet to identify all this child abuse that was reported at the time.
often stereotyped in the media and demonised for problems that are not entirely their own.
For a lot of people in Australia, they get informed through the media. And if the media is portraying a certain picture, then that's what people believe. There's always going to be the tensions between how the media reports an issue and the real issue on the ground. You know, you might have one or two offenders from a certain racial group, which is never presented like that. It's presented as if the whole group is has offending behaviour.
And they blame every time young people for drug, for alcohol, for murder, everything. And they don't see their own backyard. Their son is murdering more people, stealing more things, drinking more drug, or taking more drug. They don't see that.
They're the one which bring the movies in here, all the selfish law and the sexual abusing, man to man, woman to woman, kids, and the disco and this sort of thing. And now they're blaming to the Aboriginal people and the Indigenous people, which is we haven't got one of those before the 77. The Queen Authority was landing in Australia.
And their way is not of our ways,
Meninggalkan balan maringgi, meninggal tiang balan maringgi kerja markode. Yuta yulngo kayuta niyal kayuta derango, membang, waktu marang, wala langgal liyay, kamango jika nama, kalis nimbuturi, kagalkan hati.
When exposed to another culture, like through the American movies, TV, that bring in Western values, where there are such things as vindictiveness, violence, then those things must be passed on.
We live in a stage of anarchy. This is the people thing. Subculture is a culture that destroying who we are. You cannot say it's Aboriginal people. It's a disease that's just moving right across the world. Anarchy, there's no law.
That law has been introduced to us, and everything that comes with it is an invader of our system, our people, our life, our mind, our very ngayang within.
In the past 15 years, extraordinary changes have begun to happen in Australia. The nation on the other side of the frontier has risen from its deathbed and has begun to fight back. And what a spectacle it is. As the first Australians challenge some of the greatest transnational companies in the world, and governments, and historians, and assumptions and attitudes, and disease and neglect, in order that they may claim back their share of the oldest continent, their country. This film is a glimpse of their epic story. When Captain Cook landed here in Botany Bay, he was under orders not to raise the Union Jack without the consent of the inhabitants of Australia. But Cook and Captain Arthur Phillip, who followed with the first fleet of convicts, both disobeyed these instructions. And what followed was one of the darkest and least known periods in the history of Britain's empire. The British declared Australia an empty land, in spite of the fact that there were tribes with a total population of at least 300,000, perhaps as many as 1 million. No one knew exactly, because the first Australians were not counted as human beings. Decimation was swift. Aboriginal blood carried no resistance to white disease. Lieutenant Brady, Royal Marines, reported in 1788, "From the great number of dead natives found in every part of Sydney Harbour, it appears that the smallpox has made dreadful havoc among them." But not nearly as much havoc as massacre. No British colony was born under so cruel a star as Australia. The early convict ships had brought thousands of white slaves, mostly English and Irish, transported for crimes of poverty and politics. And they became the instruments of massacre, directed by Christian gentlemen who had brought with them attitudes of racial superiority that were the staple of empire. Ironically, their cruelty was at odds with liberal reformers in Britain who were then seeking to end the slave trade. In 1837, a House of Commons Select Committee condemned the atrocities against the Aborigines. But the difference between sympathy and action was a convenient 15,000 miles.
I think it's a very calculating attitude which makes an entire nation of people write out 200 years of history and then speak only about imperial history. They speak about the pioneers, the brave white pioneers, the brave women who settled the country, as if we didn't ever exist. And all of that history is based also on the legal fiction which established for them that they legitimately owned this country. They call it terra nullius, in other words, empty continent. The law says that we did not exist in 1788. Therefore, the continent was empty, uninhabited wasteland, and therefore the British had a right to occupy it. So you see, there have never been treaties here because we didn't exist legally to sign a treaty with them.
The Aborigines were deemed to be subhuman, little more than animals, which was to justify not only the theft of their land, but their extermination. An edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, still in circulation when I was at school, described them as only an animal of prey, more ferocious than the leopard or the hyena. He devours his own species. So they were hunted and raped and massacred. And few doubted at the time that genocide was official policy. A government report in the 1850s spoke of the success of poisoning Aborigines, 100 of them laid out at a time. But until quite recently, little of this was even acknowledged. In Tasmania, the Aborigines were said to have died out. In fact, they were hunted along with kangaroos and almost wiped out. In New South Wales, by 1845, the tribe who had watched Captain Cook sail here into Botany Bay was reduced to 3 women and a man. In Victoria, an Aborigine called Old Mr. Burt recalled this story told by his mother.
They buried our babies with only their heads above the ground. All in a row they were. Then they had a test to see who could kick the babies' heads off the furthest. One man clobbered a baby's head off from horseback. They then spent most of the day raping the women. Most of them were then tortured to death by sticking sharp things like spears up their vaginas until they died. They tied the men's hands behind their backs, then cut off their penis and testicles, and watched them run around screaming until they died.
One of the most enduring myths about the Aborigines is that they did not fight back. In fact, a war of resistance lasted more than a century, some of it here on the banks of the Hawkesbury River, north of Sydney. During the 1930s, my father built a cottage here, on the beach at an Aboriginal place called Patonga. I think we knew that somebody had lived at Patonga at some time, but no one talked about it. In fact, an entire nation had lived here on and off for thousands of years. They were called the Jurag, a unique Aboriginal people, tall and slender, whose country extended to a 40-mile radius north of Sydney, and the mighty Hawkesbury River was theirs. And when the British established the town of Windsor in the early 1800s, a great war began. This war was not recorded in the Imperial Chronicles of Australia. Growing up here, I knew nothing about it, and I suspect that's still true of the people in the smart beach houses here today. And yet the Jurag inflicted on the British a casualty rate greater than that sustained by the Australian Armed Forces during all of World War II. And finally, after 22 years, outnumbered and without guns, they went down fighting to the last man, woman and child, a complete nation. Today, in a land of many cenotaphs and war memorials on which invariably is written, "Lest we forget," not one of them stands for those who fought and fell in their own country. By the 1920s, the British invasion had caused the deaths of at least 250,000 black Australians. Genocide on a massive scale. But this fact remained suppressed. except in the living memory of those who survived. Here in the Northern Territory, in the great isolated heartland of Australia, the killing of Aborigines continued well into the 20th century, and most of these also remain secret. However, in 1928, 150 miles from Alice Springs, a gang of police and cattlemen massacred at least 50 Aborigines, perhaps many more, and word got out. A public inquiry was held, and its findings were summarized in these 3 words: the shooting was justified. In giving evidence, Constable William Murray said, "We shot to kill. What use is a wounded blackfella 100 miles from civilization?"
Indeed, in the 1930s, there were massacres around here. And in Queensland, they were called nigger hunts. And I've heard white men only 5 years ago recalling their days in the nigger hunts. And yes, they justified murdering us because we didn't use the land the way they did. And as I say, it was an utterly calculating attitude. They wanted our land, and to get our land, they had to get rid of us.
We had pride in the land because, you know, we have all our sacred sites, we have all our things in there. We live by the land. We don't go and destroy the land. The land is our mother. That's what we believe in. And if it's going to be taken away from us, it's like taking someone's life away.
The uniqueness of the Australian past has been concealed. In the dream time of the Aborigine, the land is sacred, the beginning and end of life itself. The European attitude to land, that of a commodity to be bought and sold, built on and exploited, is incomprehensible to a black Australian. This is the Obiri Rock, a cathedral of the spirit, east of Darwin. The significance of these paintings was only understood by Europeans as recently as the 1950s and 60s. These pictures were painted more than 10,000 years before the pyramids. They are older and more sophisticated than the cave paintings in France, by which the European tribes have measured their civilization. The World Heritage List now recognizes them as the oldest expression of human creativity. In other words, the longest historical record of any human beings. In recent years, white historians have made contact with people whose oral history includes record of the eruption of volcanoes 5,000 years ago. Many Australians are unaware of this. To them, the Aborigine is merely an object of pity, the poor old Abo. Many only see the frontier from their jumbo jet on its way to Singapore and London, although every summer they may feel it, as winds from the deserts bring fires like this. These fires are unpredictable. They devastate the rural landscape and they reach into corners of gentility and incinerate without argument. Perhaps these fires, like the great droughts and floods, are reminders of the true nature of a country in which the majority of people may only be interlopers. The Aborigines not only survived, they developed a unique society and culture which those Europeans tied to racial stereotypes never saw or never acknowledged. Aborigines were presumed to be primitive and passive, at best noble savages, but none of this was true. In this ritual dance, for instance, the essence is humour, a put-on. In fact, they were more sophisticated than the invaders. They learnt languages better, they understood the environment better, and the civilized value of their one-family society often remained a puzzle to Europeans who were hardly civilized themselves, coming from a background of class division and brutal poverty. One European observer wrote that generosity seems so fundamental to the blacks that they have no word for thank you, nor did they have any concept of the extremes of wealth and poverty, nor were they able to fathom the invaders' idea of equality, that of freedoms negotiated between elites. The native Australians, wrote a colonial official in 1841, are a nation owning no chief, literally a pure democracy. A Victorian clergyman wrote, "The Aborigines don't seem to understand exalted rank. In fact, it's difficult to get into a blackfella's head that one man is higher than another.
Only Marlinga, just finished. Lots of family, lots of brother, and should be wearing a Marlinga.
We have a legacy of real trouble in this country because of those British atomic tests.
It's our thing, it's our stuff. Although we never call it uranium. We don't know what uranium word is. We got our own name for that.
Australia is the only society we understand to have ever provided its own uranium to an overseas nuclear weapons state to make into weapons to then bomb back on our own land.
When an atomic bomb explodes, it creates radioactive particles, some of which are heavier than others. The heavier ones fall first. The very light ones might travel around the world several times before they fall to the ground, but they will do one thing: they all fall to the ground.
My first introduction to atomic warfare was being told to turn our back on the island, and we heard this almighty explosion and roar, and then we turned around to look at the island to watch a large mushroom cloud slowly going up into millions of miles up into the sky. I was 19 at the time. I thought it was marvellous to be a witness to such a thing.
This haze over the sky, sort of, it looked like a very fine cloud, but it didn't go away. It was there for about 4 or 5 days, or could have been more. And it was light, that the sun sort of filtered through it as well, but it was there.
The aircraft that I was in took off at about 11 o'clock at night, and we flew a triangular pattern northwest out over the Indian Ocean, then south towards the Montebello Islands themselves, and then northeast again into Broome. We spent nearly 9 hours on that trip. Because it was night time, we saw no evidence of any cloud. The evidence of the cloud was in the filters that were fixed underneath the wings of the aircraft.
We're all bush hunters, fishers. That is our culture. We look forward to doing that. Take our young children out fishing and hunting. You go back before all these bombs and that were let off. Aboriginal people lived years, you know.
The cloud from the Operation Hurricane bomb did in fact traverse the country, because 3 days later aircraft operating out of Townsville picked up the radioactive particles from the explosion. 2 days later again, Royal New Zealand Air Force aircraft picked up radioactive particles out over the Pacific north of Newcastle that had emanated from the same bomb.
We patrolled the island quite regularly for a year, and then in October 1953 I went back to the islands again with a group of British scientists, and we worked on the island for 2 weeks while they collected data up there, and I worked on the island with them. A thing I've always said is they were wearing specially designed suits and gloves and boots and hoods, and I walked around in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt.
Famous British atom scientist Sir William Penny, at a press conference on his arrival in Australia, is emphatic that there will be no dangerous radiation from forthcoming tests at Maralinga. Stressing the importance of the tests, he says,
"Any weapon has to be tested. Doesn't matter whether it's a shell or a bullet, or whether it's a carrier of a weapon like an aeroplane. It must be tested."
We weren't told that we should perhaps have more showers than usual. We weren't told that we should refrain from conceiving children for some considerable time, at least 12 months. In actual fact, we were told nothing about what might ensue from having been inside the cloud. Now, the Montebillos have never been cleaned. They removed obvious debris, but they've never ever been cleaned. The government has maintained that there was no hazard to anybody connected with the tests. It's a lie, because on the Montebello Islands, to this very day, on Tremuya Island, which was the island where the bombs were set off, there are signs that say, "Radiation hazard area. Do not stay more than 1 hour. Do not raise the dust. Do not take anything off the island. Do not eat here." You can't have it both ways, but the government wants to.
As the years went by, my husband first of all got sick, and there's a lot of other people before us, and all died of cancer, some sort of cancer. Then my husband in 1962, he went down with cancer, and then 63 it was my turn. The period that when my husband died, there was about 12 people that died, all Aboriginal people, all our age group, from Derby and Broome.
It's not until years later when we started to have health problems, which was mine started late 50s, early in the 60s, when I started to have large cancerous growths removed from my body, that I started to worry about it.
So there was an understanding in those periods from the 50s through to the 70s that aerial nuclear weapons tests were having such a demonstrable effect that you could find the isotopes from those in children's teeth and in bone. People better understand there is no safe level of exposure to ionising radiation, and while the legal system may set the bar at a certain rate of exposure, that may be illegal, but it's not a safe exposure.
Most of the country was covered by these radioactive particles, especially from Operation Totem, which took place 12 months later in a place called Emu in the Maralinga area.
Dad was a young boy growing up through the area, learning the old traditional ways. You know, he did a bit of hunting, he did a bit of gathering, and you know, he lived that old traditional life where he walked around, walked with his old people also. So that experience was something that he treasures.
This is the main place, Waladina, important place. Ngurari Jajuda for this place. This is back in creation days. Our Yinjiri people, community, living here. This is Ngindaga Wabar. We can tell stories about the Ngindaga. The Ngindaga, the apprentice of the Western Australia border. He was inside the WA and he heard the noise. Because they are pretty powerful people, and in creation days he heard the noise and come all the way to here, to Waladina. But he wasn't in a hurry. He take time, he creating food, languages, different ones, and he create Enma. Mount Woodruff is that's a Ngindaga apprentice, just standing up like this, and he was looking out to Ayers Rock. But it's the highest mountain in South Australia, I think. Yeah, Mount Woodruff. But it's a Ngindaga.